Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our concurrent session. What's new in federal and state early childhood education policies, and what can state boards do to support it? My name is Winona Howe, and I am the Director of Early Learning at NASBE. So through yesterday and today, you have heard a lot of federal level policies, and some of the new changes are being made at the federal level. I believe you found the content very useful. And on the ECE side, we know that due to the pandemic, there are a huge decline in enrollment in childcare as well as kindergartens. So many states are facing the budget cut. Years of progress made by states in terms of state-funded pre-K is in jeopardy. So it's important for state board members to understand the implications of policy changes and what opportunities are presented for states. And most importantly, what state boards can do to support it. We're so excited to have two experts here with us today to take a deep dive into the early childhood education policy areas. So our first speaker is Amanda Guarino, who is the policy director at the First 5-Year Fund. She has over 17 years of experience in early childhood, and prior to her role at the First 5-Year Fund, she worked at the Department of Health and Human Services. She served a crucial role at the Administration for Children and Families, the ACF. Amanda will start with the federal policy landscape. And our second speaker is Adrienne Fischer, who is a policy analyst from the Education Commission of the state. So Adrienne has years of experience in collecting and analyzing state ECE policies and legislations. She will walk us through some trending ECE policies in states. After Amanda.
So my name is Amanda Guarino. Thanks for the introduction, Winona. I am the policy director at the First 5 Years Fund. The First 5 Years Fund is a federal advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. Our work is dedicated to sustaining, expanding supports for early learning that exists at the federal level, while identifying and advancing new and innovative ways to increase access to high quality early childhood education for children from low-income families. We work on all programs that pertain to children and families from birth through age 5, so usually talking about into kindergarten entry and the transition into kindergarten. And we're one of the only federal-facing advocacy organizations that exists that we know of. So a lot of the work that we do is completely in service to making sure that everything that's happening on the ground in states is being funneled up through the national organizations and to lawmakers on Capitol Hill and the administration to be able to advance policies and practices that are best for the kids and families of our country. So what I was going to talk about a little bit today is some of the national level and the federal level initiatives that were brought forth in the early learning and the American Rescue Plan, and how the American Rescue Plan specifically pertains to early learning, and then talk a little bit more about some opportunities in the future that FFYF sees with the new administration and Congress. So the American Rescue Plan that was passed, I think it's about a week ago, definitely had a very concerted effort and investment in early learning. And we worked really hard at the national level to ensure that that happened. So a few things I was going to highlight is that the first few slides we'll talk about the investments from the American Rescue Plan. So you'll see $14.9+ billion for CCDBG, and that's for lead agencies of CCDBG will have 2 fiscal years to obligate that funding, and it will be used for any use that normal CCDBG funding can be used for. And then the new money to the table, or not that the $15 billion in CCDBG isn't new, it is new, but it is for kind of ongoing use in the same way, is the Child Care Stabilization Fund. As you'll see, almost $24 billion for childcare stabilization. 90% of these funds would be used to award subgrants to qualified childcare providers to stabilize providers that have been opened through this entire pandemic. And the other service is to make sure that providers who have unfortunately closed because of COVID-19 are able to get up and running again. This money is a little bit different because the federal government will have to establish new accounts to pay for this, new accounts to transfer the money to states, and lead agencies may require legislative or other approvals for these processes to get the funds down to the state. So it's a little bit more complicated, but I think it will be a savior for a lot of the childcare industry that has collapsed up until this point, trying to bring them back online. Another thing that happened within the American Rescue Plan was Head Start was awarded $1 billion, and that's allocated based on the enrollment in in each program, and it's to carry out the work that's been happening through the Head Start Act, and the funds remain available through September 30th of 2022. The other two programs that I thought you'd find interesting to know about is the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA Parts B and C, that there's additional funding, $245 billion in grants for states under IDEA Part B, $250 million for IDEA Part C, and $200 million for IDEA Part B, which authorizes supplemental grants for states for preschool programs serving children with disabilities age 3 to 5. And then the other pot of money is the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Fund, providing $122.8 billion. There's some set aside inside that money to address the learning loss, as we know that is a tremendous problem that our students are facing in this country post-pandemic. Additionally, the portions of the funds are intended to address desperate impacts of the pandemic on marginalized student populations, support students experiencing homelessness, and support the continued response and relief efforts related to the pandemic. So this is all great, and this is all information that you can probably find out on the internet or on FFYF's website. We have a side-by-side document that'll tell you what's in the American Rescue Plan, and you can read all of this yourself. So I guess you might be wondering, how does this pertain to you and what you can expect with this money rolling out into states and localities. And with the CCDBG lead agencies and Head Start agencies, they'll be working diligently to determine how to spend this funding. And they want to make sure that it's spent efficiently and effectively and meeting the needs, which are great. And they may seek input from other early learning and care stakeholders, including state boards. And we really hope they do, and we're encouraging them to do that. The ESSER and IDEA funding will more directly impact SEAs. So while childcare providers may be able to access the CCDBG funding, preschool programs were not included in the CCDBG funding, which isn't really surprising, but it does provide an opportunity in the ESSER and IDEA funding for preschool programs. So the preschool program should be included in deciding how to spend ESSER funding relief dollars to meet the needs of marginalized students, including plans to address learning loss, which is required by law. Also, the IDEA early intervention and preschool programs will also be hugely impacted by the money that's coming out through these two different pots of money. So there's a lot of opportunity coming down your way. There are other opportunities on the horizon as well. These include more specifically to the fact that every major early learning program is due for reauthorization this Congress. If they haven't expired, they will be expiring soon. So they have within reauthorizations means that Congress has the opportunity to examine how programs are operating independently and as a whole, and they have the opportunity to make sure that they're assessing what's working and what's not, and tweaking these programs to make sure that they're benefiting all. So in CCDBG reauthorization is one opportunity that FFYF is pursuing. We have the opportunity to expand eligibility by revising income restrictions and potentially waiving co-pays. Identifying ways to serve families in need during non-traditional hours, and increasing reimbursement rates, providing networks that support family childcare providers, streamlining administrative tasks. One other thing that we're really interested in pursuing in CCDBG reauthorization is addressing the mental health needs of children and families in this country. We know it's great, And currently, the way CCDBG is written, it's just not a priority. We also know that unified data systems are an incredibly important piece of understanding what's happening in state level and having that data be able to be reported back and used to make sure the programs are running efficiently and effectively. So that's another thing we're looking at expanding. The last thing in CCDBG, I wouldn't say the last thing, but one of the things that's worth mentioning is that one of the changes that was made during the pandemic is that programs were able to be funded by enrollment, not attendance, and that enabled many programs to keep their doors open. So we're hoping to make that change permanent. In Head Start reauthorization, there are a number of potential things that could happen as well. We are confident that there could be developmental screenings, that we can create more linkages between early Head Start and other early learning programs like MICV. There's an extreme need to focus on trauma-informed care within Head Start, as our lowest income families that qualify for Head Start often face really troubling early years. And we also would like to see more community partnerships. And with that, the early Head Start childcare partnerships, which is part of the Head Start Act. We'd love to see that reauthorized in and of itself and grown, because it seems like a really great way to get a Head Start education to more kids. The last thing that we're going to talk about is the IDEA reauthorization, and that we're hoping to meet the needs of infants and toddlers nationally. We need to fund IDEA at a level so that infants and toddlers' needs are being met. We want to build strong coordination between Part C EI services and Part B, enhance all the efforts within early intervention, and provide greater supports to states and local agencies. Let's go to the next slide. So there are a couple of other areas of interest that don't fall into reauthorization specifically, but things where we see real opportunity at the federal level. One of them is the Preschool Development Grant B-5 program. So PDGB-5, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, as it is really a state systems building endeavor. We'd like to see, we think it's a natural time to focus on PDGB-5, since it FY22 will be the time when the 3-year grant cycles will be wrapping up. So it's a time to revise and expand PDGB-5 to consider those programs, those states that were awarded implementation grants, where they stand, and if the pandemic has potentially set them back in pursuing those really amazing strategic plans that they had set up. We're also thinking about, should there be more opportunities for different states to apply? And if so, encouraging those states to really engage with their state boards and other state affiliates to make sure that they are creating a seamless system of early learning at the state level. That's what the intent of PDGB-5 is. And there's definitely a seat at the table for state boards during those conversations. And as we move into preschool development grants and building them to become part of what's building back our community in early learning, I really look forward to engaging the state boards in these discussions in the future. So the other thing is preschool. You'll hear more and more being said about preschool and pre-K. President Biden included universal preschool as part of his plan for mobilizing American talent. It's a very specific, called out piece of the work that he intends to do as president. And part of that includes providing 3- and 4-year-olds access to free, high quality preschool, partnering with states to provide mixed delivery systems, and including preschool systems, childcare centers, family childcare, and Head Start. He considers, us all at the table together when we're talking about making sure that preschool is available to all kids, all 3- and 4-year-olds in this country. The last thing I'll mention is the early childhood workforce, which is obviously the pinnacle of everything that we do in early learning. It all revolves around the workforce. And Biden's plan also pledges to invest in strategies to retain and grow a pool of diverse and talented early childhood educators, and to give them the resources they need to be successful. So we have supported legislation, including the Early Educators Apprenticeship Act, which would create a grant program for states to develop, administer, and evaluate ECE apprenticeships. We see apprenticeships as one of the main ways that we can advance this field. And additionally, there has been some movement on the workforce through the Higher Education Act, and we've recommended efforts to strengthen teacher preparation to ensure communities are able to recruit and retain early childhood educators and maintain the current federal loan forgiveness program for early childhood educators and consider enhanced incentives. We really need to do things to incentivize people to come into the field, but if not, we're going to pay them well and respect them as a profession. We're hard pressed to keep really good early childhood educators in this field. So there have to be national led efforts underway to have that happen. The last thing I'll mention, and I apologize, I'm speaking very quickly, but I want to make sure I get all of this in, is infrastructure. You'll hear more and more in the news in the coming weeks about what's going to happen next with any sort of relief package. And we're following infrastructure and what that means for early learning very closely. There's 2 existing bills currently that mention early learning, and that is the Child Care as Infrastructure Act and the Reopen and Rebuild American School Act of 2021. Both have the Infrastructure Act has $10 billion set aside for FY22 through 26 for grants to states up to $35 million to acquire, construct, renovate, and improve childcare facilities. There are state matches associated with some of this money, but this is very nuanced, and I don't want to get into that. But the exciting thing is just yesterday, the White House announced plans for a $3 trillion infrastructure bill. And in that, there's a significant investment in early learning. So $100 billion for schools and education infrastructure, including universal pre-kindergarten, dramatically expanding spending on childcare, and extending the expansion of the child care tax credit as enacted in the American Recovery Plan. So this is on top of all the work that just happened about 10 days ago to pass the almost $40 billion worth of relief funds. We're talking about childcare now being considered part of the infrastructure of our country and being built into every single thing that happens in this country and as we rebuild from the pandemic. So it's a really exciting time for early learning. And I think there are a number of opportunities for state boards to engage in these discussions to make sure that these things are happening holistically throughout the states and being able to be very planful so that this is reflective of the communities that you're serving. I think we will have time for questions, and I hope to be able to answer some questions with you in the future. And I will be engaging with you hopefully in the future as we start to move our work ahead. But in the meantime, now that I've wrapped up my remarks, I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne to do her presentation.
So hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I hope everyone's doing well and staying healthy. As Winona mentioned, my name is Adrienne Fischer, and I'm a policy analyst at Education Commission of the States. I'm excited to have the opportunity today to share with you some of the trending topics we're seeing in state early education policies. But before we dig into the content, I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to share, especially for any of you who are unfamiliar, who Education Commission of the States is and how we support education leaders like yourselves. Education Commission of the States is a national policy organization. It's been serving state policymakers in all 50 states for nearly 60 years. We're nonpartisan and unbiased, and we cover the full spectrum of education issues from early learning through post-secondary and the workforce. We help states think through complex problems by utilizing our deep knowledge of research, best practices, and learning from other states to help policymakers make better informed decisions about what might work in their specific state context. We do this in a variety of ways. We research and report on trending education topics and are often invited to talk with groups just like this one to share about how states are approaching education policy issues and offer ideas for states to consider. So today I'll be giving a brief overview of some of the trending topics in early education, which we define as the preschool space through the early elementary grades. As state board members, I'm sure it won't be news to you that this is an important policy area. Last year, there were nearly 400 bills related to early education introduced, with over 100 enacted. And while a lot of states are still in the middle of their legislative sessions, we're already tracking more than 250 bills from 43 states. And in our analysis of this year's State of the State addresses, at least 18 governors identified early education as a priority. So I'll start with preschool, where children build those foundational skills that they really need to enter kindergarten academically, socially, and emotionally ready to learn. But first, I just want to briefly acknowledge that when we talk about preschool, there are many different pathways children take on their way to formal schooling in kindergarten. At ECS, our primary focus is typically state-supported pre-K due to its closer connection to the K-12 system. But this past year has really demonstrated how necessary it is to connect all of the intertwined branches of early education into a coherent system. In a typical year, a relatively small number of children may have a disrupted educational experience, but as we know, this year has been far from typical, and nearly every child has experienced multiple disruptions to their early education experience. So with that in mind, here are some of the trends that we're seeing in state preschool policy. First is improving access to high quality programs. Over the past year, there's been huge variation in children's educational experiences. And unfortunately, those disparities have disproportionately affected families who are most in need of access to high quality early learning. The National Institute for Early Education Research conducted a survey in December, and they found that children living in poverty had only 1/3 of the access to in-person preschool compared with wealthier families. They also found that families reported a diminished capacity in the fall to support home learning for remote education, which we can probably attribute to fatigue or work conflicts, or even more likely, both. So when you put those two scenarios together, we can anticipate that a significant portion of children have not received a sufficient educational experience. Some of the state strategies we're seeing are to really just try and stabilize those existing programs, whether that's financially, which I'll talk about more in a moment, or by relieving some administrative burdens. We're also seeing states trying to remove barriers to family participation in early childhood services by streamlining the process of connecting eligible families with programs and ensuring that programs target families most in need. Obviously, none of this is possible without stable funding. We know from experience that early education programs are vulnerable to cuts in times of economic distress. Most states don't fund their pre-K programs through the school finance formula, which tends to be a more resilient funding stream. However, despite the turmoil of 2020, we did see some momentum in a few states to increase financial contributions to pre-K. Notable examples include ballot measures in Colorado and Multnomah County, Oregon, which includes the city of Portland. But some other state strategies we're seeing this year in finance are maximizing federal funding. As Amanda mentioned, there are new opportunities for states to support early education through those federal funds. And a lot of states are still in the planning process to identify ways to combine all three of those relief packages, all three of those streams, into a coherent statewide strategy. Some states are trying to hold providers harmless by freezing enrollment numbers at 2019-20 figures in order to mitigate financial losses from enrollment disruptions or declines, or as Amanda mentioned, as opposed to awarding funding based on attendance instead of enrollment. Some states are also trying to identify innovative funding sources, such as tax revenue from medical or recreational marijuana, sports betting, or even soda, and more permanent solutions, such as including support for early childhood education in K-12 funding mechanisms. Even before the pandemic, recruiting and supporting the ECE workforce was approaching a crisis point, with annual turnover rates hovering around 1/3 and some role groups even higher. With the economy working toward a rebound, many states are going to be coping with higher demand for early care and education and lower capacity. Retention is more difficult than ever, and the industry as a whole shrank by nearly 20% by fall of 2020. So what are states trying to do to combat this? Generally creating more supports for early educators, whether that's financial through pay increases. I know, for example, that in Georgia, they made a decision to use some of their federal money to give bonuses, not just to K-12 educators, but also to pre-K educators and childcare workers, whether they were lead educators or just support staff. We're also seeing some states proposing grant programs or loan forgiveness and trying to identify alternative pathways and removing barriers really to obtaining degrees, licenses, or certifications, and providing professional development for the unique challenges educators have been and will continue to face in the classrooms. So just to give you a couple of quick examples of states, California had actually planned a pre-K expansion in 2020, and that unfortunately was delayed. But they were able to provide some financial support to their pre-K program through supplemental CCDBG funds. As Amanda mentioned, those funds are not set aside for pre-K, But there are a couple of states who, through the way that they classify their pre-K programs, were able to use some of that to support pre-K. They also extended eligibility periods to prevent families from losing services, even if they were unable to participate in remote learning for periods of time. I also wanted to highlight Washington. Last spring, I think, they created a new pathway to early childhood education certification for educators in community-based programs. And this is seen as a strategy to improve staff retention. Sometimes community-based programs tend to get ignored in policies and overlooked. Also, just last month, they enacted a bill to direct $50 million of the state's federal funding to childcare, and that will include the state's pre-K program. So now let's move on to the kindergarten through third grade space. We know that children are much more likely to build on the foundations of a high quality preschool experience when they receive a high quality early elementary education. The first thing I'd like to talk about is kindergarten enrollment. The numbers suggest that overall nationally, there's been about a 16% drop in kindergarten enrollment. And there's been a lot of reasons for that. Some families have opted for private school or private tutoring. We've heard a lot about learning pods of families grouping together, or just not enrolling their children because of safety concerns or job conflicts. Some parents chose to keep kids in early learning programs that provided in-person options rather than trying to navigate remote learning in kindergarten. And some of the implications here. So only 19 states in the District of Columbia require kindergarten, but over 80% of age-eligible children do attend full-day kindergarten. Research shows that full-day K participation positively impacts academic achievement and social development. And not having these experiences can be detrimental for young kids. Even children who did attend kindergarten in the past year were likely to be fully or partially remote and likely to have missed out on some of that social skill development, as well as an understanding of school culture and rules and other such things. What this means is we could see large variation in students' readiness and skills, depending on their experiences and opportunities over the last year. We might see disproportionate cohort sizes in first grade and possibly kindergarten, which might impact class sizes and staffing needs for school. What we're seeing states doing about this is looking at altering first grade entry requirements. As I mentioned, most states don't require kindergarten, but some are considering a change to their policies, and others might begin requiring an assessment or other demonstration of school readiness in order to enter first grade. Other states are looking at limiting class sizes. Obviously, this would require additional resources for districts and schools with higher than typical cohort sizes. By now, we've all heard of the COVID slide. Research is showing us that these learning gaps can be larger for younger students because underdeveloped skills in literacy, math, and other areas can negatively impact subsequent achievement. States are looking at different ways of addressing this. Summer remediation or extended year programs are being proposed in a lot of states. I think there's a lot of opportunities in some of the federal funding, especially with the learning loss set aside percentage, to use that money to fund this. We're also seeing states looking at different ways of approaching screeners and formative assessments throughout the year to help teachers analyze student progress, as well as engaging families. Some states are considering more robust standards for their kindergarten entry assessments or changing the timing, frequency, or usage of assessments. And the last trend I want to talk about here is literacy. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen fourth grade reading scores slowly improve, but in recent years, they've stagnated. And based on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, only 35% of the country's fourth graders are reading proficiently, and there are significant gaps between racial, demographic, and language groups. And that was before the pandemic. The 2021 NAEP assessments have been postponed, but some states have managed to gather preliminary data. Ohio recently reviewed their English language arts scores for third graders, comparing their fall 2020 scores to fall 2019. They found a decline roughly equivalent to about a third of a year's worth of learning. Overall, their proficiency levels were down 9%, although there was a lot of variation across the state. And the declines were more pronounced among districts that began the year fully remote compared to districts using a hybrid or in-person instructional model. And finally, on average, Black students experienced much steeper declines than their peers. Some of the state strategies here are promoting research-based curricula, developmentally appropriate assessments that connect students with intervention, and professional supports for educators. Sometimes states develop these strategies, these policies separately over time, but in recent years, some states have enacted comprehensive legislation, creating a system of evidence-based curricula and instruction, screening and assessment, multi-tiered interventions for struggling students, pre-service educator preparation standards at the post-secondary level, and in-service professional development. A couple of notable pieces of legislation. Tennessee actually called a special session in January to address the impacts of COVID on education, and they passed Senate Bill 7002, which establishes after-school and summer learning camps for struggling students with priorities given to students in the K-4 grades, and especially those qualifying for temporary assistance for needy families. It also creates a statewide tutoring recruitment program to assist students in need of remediation. And this bill is pending, but Florida has introduced a bill that would create new literacy supports, including a tutoring program for K-3 students, enhanced professional development for educators, and a focus on family engagement for struggling students. This bill is a little bit unique because this system of supports would be provided by a system of regional literacy systems. The last thing I want to touch on briefly is supporting social and emotional health. While certainly it's not unique to the early education context, there's been a marked increase in young children who need mental health support as a result of the pandemic. Research by the American Academy of Pediatrics found a 14% increase in parent-reported problem behaviors among children. So some states are looking at assessment and screening to match students with treatment and supports and get a better understanding of overall student wellness, as well as using social and emotional indicators of progress to assess school climate and health. They're also providing access to supports like counseling or mental health referrals, using SEL embedded curricula or policies, such as trauma-informed approaches to address behavioral issues, and ensuring that staff receive professional development and training to better understand and recognize mental health issues. I've included some related resources that you might find useful. We'll be sharing this presentation, so you'll be able to follow the links in the document. We're also approaching that time of year when we're going to start seeing a lot of movement in legislatures and more bills being enacted. So stay tuned, as ECS will be continually updating our resources and summarizing those state actions. On behalf of ECS, I want to thank you for inviting us to participate today. And just as a reminder, in addition to early learning, ECS policy staff are tracking state action in over 60 issue areas. So please reach out to us with any questions, or if you need additional resources, we're always happy to help. Back to you, Winona.
Thank you so much, Adrienne, and thank you, Amanda, for a great presentation. I will just ask some questions that I have in my mind. So in the past, especially during the PDG, Preschool Development Grant planning process, I actually heard some of our state boards or SEAs, they kind of complain about the planning process in their state. So I think stakeholder engagement piece is just so important for us when NASBE for state board members. So what is the strategies you would recommend state boards for SEAs to utilize to ensure they're part of the conversation, part of the planning process?
I'm happy to jump in and mention, I think that, things differ from state to state, obviously, and relationships are a huge piece of all the work that we all do every day. The PDGB 5 is such an outstanding opportunity to have state board members at the table and part of the discussion and formulation of state systems, that it's important to build those relationships and seek out. I think we can learn a lot from the information that exists on the grants that currently exist, or at least states who are awarded their initial grants, even if they didn't get the continuation and implementation grants, rounding back to try to figure out where those grants lived and reach out to those organizations to figure out if they will be pursuing further grant opportunities, and to determine how, in advance of there being a funding opportunity, in advance of that, trying to figure out how these systems can work better together. So then when there is the opportunity, you're not starting from ground zero, that there's already a relationship built. So there does need to be, I think, a little bit of work done in advance of the grant opportunity being announced. And this is work that you all do every day. It's about relationship building, but being able to look back at who was awarded those grants, which organizations were awarded those grants in the first round, and reaching out and making those contacts, I think would be a good first step.
Yeah, I agree with Amanda. I think that sometimes the timelines for these grants are very fast. And I think collaboration at that stage is very difficult to accomplish when you're also trying to write a proposal and figure out how to get the grant itself completed. So I think laying that groundwork before you're getting into the actual grant writing stage is very important.
Great, thank you both. And we will also make sure we have great connection with you guys and with AF American Administration of for the Children and Family, and to ensure our state boards are on top of the timeline and everything. And my second question is about the workforce development. So in our prep call, I talked about why this is important for NASBE, and we do see state boards have a lot of authority over this issue. And I seen like in the state federal level, there are a couple of provisions in the law to talk about the workforce development. So over all the things are very critical for this issue. Is there a place that you think state boards should prioritize first? So who want to start first?
Well, I wouldn't begin to understand the full breadth and scope of all the work that's happening with the state boards. I mean, the workforce is, of course, the key linchpin piece of quality early learning delivery and reception among kids and families. If you don't have a qualified, well-compensated workforce, then you're really kind of teetering on disaster within an early learning system. So the idea of how to support that workforce, from a federal perspective, we work on it every day. And I feel like sometimes I feel like a bit of a broken record, because a lot of what we do reverts back to funding. And we need to get states and communities the money they need to be able to invest the time and effort into creating systems around the workforce to be able to support the workforce. So I feel like, there are definitely advocacy efforts that state boards can do to become part of those national conversations. But I think it's also a matter of kind of the same situation as with the preschool development grant B5 is, establishing what your plan is, so that if that money does come down from the federal government, like the increase of funds that we've seen in the American Rescue Plan, and we're seeing that are being proposed in infrastructure investments, what will you do when that money hits the states, and how can you then take it to build back your system of early learning and care in your community? Because obviously, as much as this is a federal program, it does differ very much from state to state, even locality to locality. So it's a matter of having that plan in place. And we really do value the feedback of the state boards. I can speak for FFYF as we continue to move into this work with the new Congress and a new administration. We will be reaching out to you to help guide the work we're doing and how we're making those advocacy and requests to Congress to make sure that they are reflective of what is happening in the states. I don't pretend to know exactly what the best way to roll things out for you would be. And we want to make sure that that is baked into any legislation that we have passed. Then once the money comes to you, it's easy for you to implement.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is just to piggyback on what Amanda was saying about building that understanding that the workforce is part of the whole system, and knowing that you can't move one piece without paying attention to another, and that it means including, everything from, post-secondary all the way down to like, what's your recruitment strategy, like from the bottom and also from the top, and trying to figure out what your needs are as a state, and recognizing that in order to build a high quality early learning system, you can't ignore that piece, especially with some of the retention rates we're seeing. If you're losing a third of your workforce every year, you can't build a high quality workforce. You can invest all you want in professional development, but that's not going to matter if those people aren't there year after year.
Great. So I do want to mention for NASBE, we are working with 9 states and Guam in our state network. So all of them are working on something about ECE workforce. So for example, the ECE licensure issue and the compensation issue and the early learning standards, which would, piggyback to the teacher prep program requirement. So I think what you said is very true. Everything will tie back to funding. But at the same time, I think state boards, they do have policy levers that they can utilize to kind of move this effort forward. Great. And let me see if we have other questions from the audiences. So we don't have that. We have only 2 minutes left. So for the last 2 minutes, okay, I'll just ask a question. So Adrienne, you talked about social emotional, and Amanda, you talked about in the CCDBG that you said it's for the first time to talk about mental health for children. I'm so glad you guys mentioned this because last year we received a lot of technical assistance requests from states, and many of them is about social emotional well-being for not just for children, but also for the teachers. And we know these two groups are just very important, and everything they do kind of, intertwined into each other. Teacher has to take care of themselves before they go to the classroom, then to teach. So, so what do you think? So just look forward to this year, maybe. So do you think there will be more support coming from state on this issue and also from the federal issue on this topic?
I'll go first just because I can actually think of an example. I know that it's something that some states are starting to hear and pay attention to. In terms of action, I hope we will see more, but I know for sure there was a bill in, I want to say Nevada, and at this point it's just requesting a study, but I feel like typically you see these and they're focusing just on student mental health, but this is a study that's looking at the effects of the past year of remote learning on both students and teachers, and to make recommendations to the legislature. So hopefully there will be more. I think we do need more research, not only about how teachers have been effective, but how we can help them. I think this is a pretty unprecedented circumstance. I think certainly teacher fatigue has always been an issue, but it's just at a level that we've never seen before. So really figuring out what it is that they need and listening to teachers and hearing them.
Amanda?
Yeah, and I totally agree with Adrienne. I would just say we're just working really hard to bake it into the levers that we have at the federal level to make sure that any reauthorization, any program improvement is really focusing on these things and taking them into account to pay specific mind to health, mental health, social, emotional development of children and families and teachers as well. When we talk about reauthorizations, when we talk about increasing professional development or technical assistance into these systems, we always are continuously having these discussions with lawmakers to make sure that they understand the key component of mental health and how so many things trickle down from there and how it needs to be a highlight of the work that's being done at the program level. So programs need to be equipped to address it, whether it be through their own professional development or through resources through the state to make sure that they have those skills and those skilled individuals working in the state to be able to do coaching and things of that nature to make sure the programs are reaching that sort of excellence.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so we don't see any other questions, and I just want to thank Adrienne and Amanda for your great presentation, and thank you so much for a great landscape content for our members as well. And we do hope to work with you again in the future. So thank you so much, ladies, and have a great rest of the day. So take care. Thank you.